Thank you very much indeed. I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that it's 4:25, it's been a long day, and a few of you may have had to leave for your trains, and you're getting a bit dopey. The good news is that this is put amongst, if not the, most interesting and most informative panel with some of the highest profile speakers that you've heard all day. So put your phones away, get on the edge of your seat. You're going to be dazzled by this. Amongst the reasons are that we have some outstanding high-profile speakers today. I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Katarina.
Thank you so much. High expectations, I see. My name is Katarina Pranjic. I'm Head of Regulation and Policy at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and also, until very recently, Chair of OIX Open Identity Exchange.
Thank you. Matthew.
Matt Noyes, U.S. Secret Service. Being an international audience, I have to clarify what the Secret Service does. I'm in the Office of Investigations. We detect and arrest people engaged in fraud, whether that's counterfeiting of currency, access device fraud, computer fraud and abuse. And so I lead the strategy policy team that does that through our 3,000 people, 162 offices worldwide.
Michel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm Michel van Bellingham. I've been chairman of BIPT, Belgian regulator, since 2017. And I was the chair of the body of European regulators for electronic communications in 2021.
So, just to be clear, you're hearing people who are either controlling the present or future of your business or are trying to help you and your customers stay safe from the bad guys, or both. The topic of this panel is collaboration. I talked this morning a little bit about how important it was for us as an industry to collaborate with law enforcement and particularly regulators. Here we have a number of examples of where this has actually taken place and indeed where it needs to take place. Let's go through some of those examples. Michel, why don't you start?
Thank you very much, Andrew. I will start with an example of international cooperation. And this is something we've put in place very recently in the national regulatory framework. And this is about something a little bit different. This is the CLI spoofing, the caller line identification. And you know, you receive a call, it's a very simple situation, with a so-called Belgian number. Can be a geographical, non-geographical, short or mobile number. Could be your bank, but actually it's not, for obvious reason, because it is an incoming international call with a spoof number. So how can you deal with that? Well, and you know that in the larger Europe, the CEPT, that's the conference of the telco and postal administrations, it's about 15 countries, put their brains together, and they issued last year in November a recommendation to tackle this problem. As a result, we have implemented what we have already has as principle in the Belgian law, the prohibition of modifying the CLI for a certain purpose. And we put it in place, and so this entered into force at the very beginning of this month, so it's very recent. And just in a nutshell, it is forbidden for an operator not to block this type of incoming calls when it is about the geographical, non-geographical, or short-range number, with some exceptions. For mobile numbers, it will be implemented in December, because mobile is a little more complex. You can think of the very simple situation where you have an incoming international call from a Belgian number in international roaming situation, which is perfectly legitimate. So the rule will be there to block if it's not legitimate. But if for technical reason you can not be sure, then as an operator you have to delete the CLI. So you will receive the call, but not the CLI. Just put in a nutshell. And this is the outcome of a very good international cooperation. And this measure will be put in place in other countries as well. Not only Europe, of course, but in different European countries.
And you, as a regulator, you had to collaborate both with Belgian operators, Belgian carriers, and also overseas networks as well?
Of course, yes, that's what we do.
To what are you reliant on the overseas carriers to do?
So in this context, you know, just generally speaking, we have a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. So we spoke with everyone, so without limitation.
And how does this get enforced? What happens when the carriers go, yeah, we know we're regulated, but there was a technical problem and we didn't do what we were supposed to do, sorry.
So that's, Andrew, a little bit too soon to say, because the measure has just been put in place just some days ago. And of course, we'll have to make a kind of assessment of this measure. But I'm pretty confident that it's very efficient.
So if there are telecommunication service providers here who are unwittingly, of course, involved in the transit of spoof Belgian CLIs into the Belgian network, who will come and knock on their door at midnight? Are you sending your guys in? Or
maybe not at midnight, but the day after, I think that it will.
This will be the Belgian regulator
that
will work with the national regulator to send the boys around.
Yeah.
That's a fairly innovative and unusual approach, isn't it?
It is.
So we'll see whether it works or not. Thank you.
Indeed.
Matthew.
Yeah. I mean, so the core thing we do is detect and arrest people. That's our mandate. My KPI, that term was used several times today, is not arrest, though. It's fraud loss prevented and asset recovered, which measures in the billions of dollars per year in typical years, 400 million returned to victims of fraud last year. I'm going to bring this around to telecom here briefly. And so how we prioritize our work is going after the most deceptive frauds out there. We don't want to create an ecosystem where we're going after less skilled actors and improving the capability of fraudsters and making them even more deceptive. So we do have to fiercely prioritize what we do. We have limited capacity. And we face a challenge where most of the people perpetrating the fraud are outside of our jurisdiction. They're outside of the US. They're using technology platforms in multiple countries. And we have to work in that international cross-sector environment to detect their activity, recover the assets, make victims whole, and apprehend the perpetrators. Fortunately, in the US system, when we do get them, we tend to get them very long sentences. So a 30-year sentence is not uncommon in terms of the cases we work. That is fantastic because if you're serving a 30-year sentence, you want to reduce that time, which makes you very inclined to work with law enforcement. And so we talk to them. We understand the leaders, how they're executing their schemes. And then we try to engage with industry of how do you help us detect this and address this? And so what we are consistently hearing, and it's grown substantially over recent years, which is why I'm here and engaging more with telecoms, is one-time passwords over SMS should not be used, period. That's NIST 863B has said that since 2016, perhaps not as clearly as I would like, others would like, but that is the case. It puts telecoms in a really awkward position where you're providing a technology and a platform not made for authentication that is getting used for authentication. And so how do you resolve that tension is a challenging problem, right? The robust criminal services to intercept one-time passwords, do port-out fraud, SMS, or SIM swapping are substantial. And so how do we work together to address that, to detect that activity? I recognize, in the presentations here today, preventing every fraudulent message from being delivered is an extraordinarily hard challenge. Preventing any customer service rep doing a SIM swap for a customer is an extraordinarily hard challenge. But what is a solvable challenge is being a good witness to that crime occurring, engaging with law enforcement, helping us identify the victim, the perpetrator, and then also engaging cross-sector with financial services to prevent financial loss or reduce financial loss to those victims of fraud. And so trying to maximize the value of that collaboration across financial services and telecoms, where we're in this awkward state where we've come to rely on an authentication method that should never have been used, one-time passwords over SMS, as they quickly transition to an alternative authentication method that is more secure.
And when you're trying to make that flow of information and that collaboration work in order to detect both incidents and patterns of activity and put in place mechanisms to stop that, where are you finding the greatest resistance?
I think it is not a good understanding. There was a desire in many businesses, particularly in financial services, to quickly use more than a password for authentication. That is good. That is the right instinct. It landed on the wrong technology, unfortunately. And so changing that paradigm, changing those, the kind of market dynamics that have led them to the technology platform that they are using for authentication to something else is the challenging piece. And if technology platforms and financial services make that change quickly, we'll be in a much better place. But it's going to take time for them to do that. And they, right now, I do not think fully appreciate the risk and even what the existing standards in the US, when I talk about NIST 863B, does say in terms of how the public switch telephone network should not be used for authentication.
Quick masterclass minute. Many of you will know that the NIST standards for identity verification authentication 863 are just in the process of being updated from version 3, which is now in antique shops, to version 4, which will be published in 2022. It appears that it actually may see the light of day next year, and the very latest draft has just been released in the last week or two. Matthew, do you just want to say what 863B-4-B has to say about the future, about SMS, and therefore the future of some of the business, some of the people slumbering gently here this afternoon?
So it is the standard in the US on digital identity. So it's mandatory on US government services, how they're provided online. And then it's generally considered a best practice by regulators in the US and internationally to guide good business practices in the space. So that's the standard. 63B, or Bravo, is particularly around authentication. And so quick history lesson, when they were last updating it, which was around 2016, their draft came out and said no one should use public switch telephone networks for authentication as an additional factor, period, full stop. They got some pushback on that. There is an arguable need for certain types of online or digital services of low value, which I would say a bank account or retirement account is not, and for certain accessibility needs where it may make sense to use. And so they included it under a category of restricted. So they prohibited use of email as an authentication method, delivering a one-time password through email, and identified public switch telephone network as a restricted method. Unfortunately, people seem to glean onto the fact that it was in there as restricted and missed all the controls that ought to go along with providing it as a restricted method. Have an alternative authentication method. Implement additional risk compensating controls to validate, authenticate, identify, record keep around when you're using it. Check with the telecom operator. Did the number get reassigned recently? And those controls that were identified for use of a restricted authentication method largely went unimplemented amongst US industry, albeit the standard is not mandatory for them. It is considered a guiding best practice. And so the current update just published a couple weeks, it's open for public comment through October 7th off the top of my head. It restates the 2016 guidance in that regard, bolsters it a little bit, helping better communicate the extreme risk when you're sending what is intended to be a secret, a one-time password, over an insecure communication method. And so, yeah, that's out there for public comment. I encourage comments. NIST receives comments domestically, internationally. Everyone's welcome to comment. But it's something we work closely with NIST to how do we, and with regulators in the US, to how do we help, particularly financial services, understand the extreme risk they're putting account holders on when they use an authentication method like that.
Very good. Katarina, you've had a tremendous view of the way that industry interacts with regulators, interacts with the various other stakeholders in the financial services area. You very much wanted to talk about regulation. Everybody in the audience very much wants to listen to regulation. Go for it.
Close the doors. Nobody's leaving until we go through the regs. I appreciate that I have been a little bit more passionate about the regulation in this space than the others, but I'll try to summarize. I think we live in the exciting era when it comes to economic crime and regulation across the world, because what I'm observing in my role, and I'm looking into different regulation trends in different regions and what drives them, I have seen that different regions like European Union are addressing key problems through the regulation that they are introducing. So in European Union, for example, the key theme is harmonization. European Union had enough about different countries not implementing some of the rules, so now they're introducing 6 AML package, the new regulation, and they also introduce a new AML authority that is going to be in charge of different industries across the European Union. What's really important is that they have put a lot of attention on fraud as well. Through the proposal of the PSD3, we see that there is lots of conversation about protecting the consumers. Also, you just heard my colleague speaking about IDAS too. So it's another very important initiative if we talk about identity space and fraud space. However, I want to also bring attention to what's happening in UK, for example. UK using the opportunity after Brexit to introduce the legislation that is going to tackle the uniquenesses of that territory. So they introduced something called Economic Crime Plan. That plan has, so the government divided about 400 million pounds across different needs in the economic crime prevention space. New legislation has been introduced, for example, lots of attention on synthetic fraud, synthetic identity fraud, identity verification introduced in the Companies House through the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, but also some other legislation that is being under review, like money laundering regulation, and of course the most popular one is the APP fraud reimbursement clause that has been introduced, that is going to become applicable in October this year, where in payment sector you see a division between sender and the receiver, splitting the reimbursement for the victim of fraud. Now, that is something that is really important to mention in this sector as well, because in Singapore, we are seeing that this is now being extended to telecom industry as well. So it's only given the data that is being provided in this industry and some of the fraud trends, it's to expect that telco industry is going to become one of the obliged entities under a couple of different regulations that are currently being drafted. So it's definitely something to look out for. And just the last one around the digital identity in the UK, we know because of the elections now, DPDI, which is UK version of GDPR, didn't pass through the wash because of the elections. However, now the Kings announced that the new Smart Data Bill is going to introduce a digital identity trust framework in the UK, and we are all very impatient to see if there are going to be any changes similar to IDAS2 or not. Or is IDAS2 going to turn into the golden standard, considering a couple of other initiatives across the world? However, all of this is going to have a huge impact on fraud space across the world, and definitely in telco industry.
That was very good and very quick. There are a number of topics that you've raised there that actually I think will be of general interest. But let me just touch on one, which is very much a question of collaboration, particularly in the UK. In the United States, synthetic identity is a huge topic. The Federal Reserve has engaged and collaborated with industry and law enforcement in a coherent attempt to address synthetic identity. Sorry, for those of you who don't know, synthetic identity is where a fraudster is able to create an account in the name and typically with the face of somebody who literally doesn't exist. So the social security number may have been stolen from one person or doctored. The address may be of somebody else. The name is fictitious. The date of birth never existed. And the face is of somebody that was generated on a deep fake. And therefore, when a crime takes place, firstly, there's no victim, and therefore there's no victim to complain, and therefore it takes longer to detect a theft against the synthetic identity because nobody's phoning up their bank and screaming. And secondly, there's no comeback. There's no enforcement possible because the perpetrator actually is non-existent, and therefore the real perpetrators get off scot-free. In the United States, there is a tremendous collaborative effort to deal with synthetic identity. In other countries, this seems to be much less an issue, which is particularly in the United Kingdom, where we have the same rather picturesque identity infrastructure that there is in the United States, and therefore synthetic fraud, the story of which dates back to the day of the jackal in the 1970s, is prevalent, and yet it never gets talked about. It's not a subject for discussion.
Do you know what's interesting, Andrew? It's a great topic, and it's just timely because in our company we did a study called Frankenstein identities. It's about exactly the identities that have partially the real identities data and then patched with some fake data on top of that. And it's a problem because those identities are very difficult to identify because until they commit fraud, they look absolutely normal. They build their credit score. So through this study, they have observed two different trends. They said 72 million consumers that we have looked into on all of their data, almost 3 million of them are actually Frankenstein identities, and they pose a risk of more than 4.7 billion pounds damage to UK businesses if nothing is changed by the 2027. Now, those are really big numbers, and we are influencing the government to do some steps around it because we managed to observe two different things. One is that there are synthetic farms and synthetic factories. In rural areas, you have a cottage that has been rented for the last 7 years that is now being associated to 450 people living there. So you can observe that there is something really wrong about that identity. But then at the same time, something similar happening in Oxford when a 9-terrace flat has 150 people.
Who needs, in the context of collaboration, who needs to do what to do better on this in the United Kingdom in particular?
Well, there are some initiatives already around there is a synthetic identity sandbox collaboration happening. That's really good. So I don't think we're doing an awful job here. I just think that we could do a little bit more better if we were to participate in the whole of the process, from the regulation creation to exchanging the observations of what we see the current trends are to warn the others, and in the end, what are the lessons learned and how are we going to use technology jointly to fight that back.
Matthew, this is clearly something you're familiar with.
Yes.
Yeah, if I could add to, I mean, it is a real challenge, and this is one of the things that the leaders of these criminal organizations flag for us is how responsive they are to different jurisdictions taking different measures. And particularly that's around financial services, account opening, and financial flows, right? Because it's one thing to be able to defraud someone and get someone to send money to another account. It's another to get it out of that financial system to where you can actually profit off it. And so what they leverage there is money mule networks. And so these are either remotely opened accounts, witting or unwitting fraud victims, moving funds through their accounts, or accounts that have been compromised and they're accessing remotely to move. All three of those are fundamentally an identity or authentication issue. So the remote account opening in particular is an acute challenge in the US because we're one of the few jurisdictions, and then there's a handful of others, that allow account opening with foreign identity documents. And so how this often looks is a digital image of a foreign passport and a digital image of a face, maybe a video, a liveness check, that perhaps no one even reviewed. They just keep it as a record, which is good. I like record keeping. Like, as a criminal law enforcement agency, being able to subpoena for whatever records you have down the road is better than saying we keep no records. But that's it. And so they're able to do that remotely, never setting foot in a G7 country, in any country that remotely cooperates or effectively enforces the law. And that creates a substantial challenge. And then there's the authentication piece as well, which I already highlighted on the one-time passwords. as well as the other substantial weakness. And so, but what they identify for us is as, for example, Singapore has put in more controls around authentication. The criminal networks that were going after Singaporeans are now shifting to jurisdictions that they perceive weak, that they have been successful in establishing those money mule accounts. Why I highlight that is, again, because that aspect of the financial services in the countries where the customers you serve as telecom operators is what drives the fraud traffic on your network to be able to go after those individuals and remove proceeds from them and from the jurisdiction and the financial institutions there.
I think the thing that you said, though, which is really important and kind of meandered through some of the discussions today, typically fraud and the control over account takeover was traditionally seen as being a way of stealing money from victims. What you're saying is that it's actually involved in something much nastier, more dangerous and more valuable, which is as an intermediate stopping point for the proceeds of crime. So if money is stolen through push payment fraud, for example, it has to go somewhere, and if it goes to a compromised or remotely controlled account, then it can be laundered, which is a much higher value piece of crime than just stealing everybody's life's earnings. Or
yeah, no, exactly right. And so to put this context in terms of the economic size of the issue, so the most credible estimates for, let me back up. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, they just published a report in January. They're the U.S. Bank Secrecy Act financial anti-money laundering regulator in January of, in the prior calendar year, 2023, they received over 200 billion in transactions in suspicious activity reports linked to identity weaknesses. 200 billion in a single calendar year of what was reported, so that was detected by a financial institution. That's a huge sum. When it comes to particularly the scam compounds that the presenter from GASA highlighted at the start of the day, credible academic estimates of that is their total revenue strictly that was moved through cryptocurrency, not talking wire transfers, cash deposits, couriers, other methods of moving money, was over 75 billion US dollars value, primarily through Tether over since 2021, so over the last 3 years and change. That's the financial incentive in terms of revenue on the criminal network side. They're not going to stop from minor nuances in terms of blocking messaging. It requires a much more aggressive approach.
That segues to another point I'd just like to raise with you and to ask Michel, because a lot of the discussion and a lot of the defense is all about stopping individuals having their money stolen. But we're rapidly moving into a world in which fraudsters are making more money, not by stealing money or conning them into fraud, but through push payment fraud, through convincing people willingly to make payments, sometimes very large payments, to destinations that they shouldn't do. To what extent are things like originating line calling line identifier defenses, to what extent are those, do you think, addressing the previous problem, yesterday's problem, and to what extent can they help with combating this really awful problem of push payment fraud, which is rapidly becoming a political as well as a criminal matter, as well as a law and order issue?
But in relation to that, Andrew, if you allow me, I just wanted to start to say a few words because I am looking at the countdown and getting a little anxious.
Please do.
And just as maybe it could be considered as a little bit complementary to the previous presentation Sham Kering gave us on SMS smishing and the solution developed to combat this. We, of course, had the same situation in Belgium at the same period, COVID time, at the beginning of 2020, a lot of complaints, the pressure on the regulators to fix this quickly, asked by Parliament, for instance. And together with the industry, we've set up a platform where all these fraudulent messages were forwarded and blocked. But it was just a quick win, or what we call a tactical solution, just to buy some time and to find something more structural. And we came to the conclusion that we could work with a SMS sender ID registry, as mentioned in the presentation. Although in Belgium there is something very specific, the alphanumeric SMS sender ID is forbidden. Ah. So you have not that problem. And there is another solution we have contemplated and chosen. It's the content scanning of these fraudulent messages. Of course, you will tell me, is it allowed? Is it aligned with privacy law? So we needed to engage with our national DPA to see to which extent this type of massive system could be put in place. We needed to convince politicians and parliament that it was the best way to deal with. And we were quite successful because the legislation was adopted in that direction. And that has cost money for operators, and they need to be compensated for their efforts. We make use of the resilience and recovery facility, so the open fundings. We organized together with our colleagues of the Center for Cybersecurity in Belgium, a kind of tendering, allowing operator to ask for this funding, and actually for the time being, 2 of them successfully applied and have put that system in place, which is AI processed. So it comes in addition to what already exists in terms of scanning, volume scanning or metadata. Here is it about content and with a very, very strict framework. But as a result, after the first month of this year, 13 million messages have been blocked, to the big satisfactions of the banks, because we work also with the bank sector. And so we need to encourage other operators to do the same, to have the kind spam shield, if I may call this that way, especially when it comes to newcomers on the market. Because when you are a new operator, it won't be your first priority to combat fraud, fortunately, but that's the reality. And just to finish with that, that's where we stand at the time being. It's a rather tough approach, more radical than the registry, but it seems to work.
Is Belgium the only country in the world?
No, not. We're not. And I think in other continents, I think it's a case in India as well, if I'm right, and I think Australia. So there are other examples in the world, but in Europe, maybe not so much for the time being.
And in the context of collaboration, did you get support from the other industry players, or did you get a lot?
Yeah, sure.
Or did you get a lot of push?
No, absolutely not. Because they're victims too. So I think that we try to design this type of technical and structural solution, and for the time being, it seems to be rather successful.
And how quickly were you able to design and deploy?
No, that's not so fast, because I was talking about the very beginning of the COVID period, at the beginning of 2020, and so it took more or less 2 or 3 years to put this in place.
Which, considering that you're maneuvering the regulators, the national cybersecurity organizations, the financial services, and that strikes me as being an astounding achievement. Are you seeing that happening anywhere else in Europe?
Anywhere. I don't know. I've no idea. I think that it could be because it's not so difficult to put in place, and it's rather efficient.
So I was hoping to also thank you for injecting that, Michel, because that was an important thing which the audience needed to hear about. I did want to address perhaps measures to resist push payment fraud, which is a huge political issue, but let's just see if there's anyone in the audience who would actually like to ask a question. Let's see if you're all deeply slumbering or so utterly blown away that you're too tired from writing notes.
It's all clear.
There's a question. Is the microphone heading over?
Hello.
Okay, we see you.
Matt, John Davies, ANIA. I had a question. You know, we dealt all day about the scale of fraud and just how 1% of GDP, the numbers that we're talking about today. And you brought it up about the actual going after the money. It's something I'm kind of curious about. I realize there's a lot of complications with different jurisdictions. In other words, if someone's made a payment through a payment service, that money has to go somewhere. It has to be in a bank account in the Caribbean or in Singapore or in America. So how does your office, and are you aware of international efforts to go to sort of try to retrieve that money and work in a cooperative fashion, or is that just not possible because of the jurisdictional complexity?
No, I mean, it does happen. And some of it depends on the payment rail used and how does that then mesh with jurisdiction. So to be clear, I mean, criminal law enforcement, everything we do is through a court process, through an independent judiciary, right? So if we're ever, you know, in U.S. law, it's a seizure if you're messing with someone's possessory interest, even if they have a rightful or wrongful interest in that asset. If there's a possessory interest and you're messing with it, an independent judiciary has to approve it. So that's, hey, I want to make sure that context is clear, because that's not the case in every jurisdiction. And so what we tend to not do in the US that some other jurisdictions do is what's called substitute asset seizure. Say, this asset is outside of our jurisdiction, but you have a car or a house in our jurisdiction, we'll seize that. That is relatively rare in US criminal enforcement. Other jurisdictions do a bit more of that. We do have the advantage of kind of corresponding bank account relationships, and so working with financial institutions, most of our asset recovery is through voluntary freezes. So we notify the financial institution that those appear to be proceeds of fraud, they freeze the account, and then they then have time to work to return that. The challenge when it comes to what's called in financial services first-party fraud, which is most of what we're talking about in scams, is the victim doesn't identify that for potentially ever, right? Or it could be months or weeks, and they're typically going through a degree of denial and grief before they come to terms with that. So we have near 100% asset recovery rate if we learn of the fraudulent transfer within 72 hours of the transfer occurring. That's not often the case in first-party fraud matters, where the victim's taking months to come to terms with the fact that they were defrauded. Other piece, so crypto or assets on digital ledger technology are a big piece of this. I would say that the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, their guidance on virtual asset service providers as financial institutions that have anti-money laundering obligations, getting full enforcement and action on that globally is a huge priority. There is the advantage when it comes to the digital ledger or distributed ledgers is where is that asset? And so we oftentimes think of an asset as a physical thing that exists in one location. When it comes to assets recorded on a distributed ledger, that asset exists everywhere that distributed ledger operates. And so that then gives a jurisdictional ability to go after that broadly. And so some countries are leveraging that, some countries less so. And so it's pretty variable. But again, I mean, our asset recovery figure, right, in terms of the investigative work of the Secret Service, we're one of those rare profitable government entities where we're recovering more assets than our budget.
Now, we're a few minutes over time, but I want to steal a couple more minutes just to ask Katarina about something that you just mentioned and will be of particular interest, which is that the refund, in the United Kingdom, the new refund regime, which at the moment involves banks refunding victims of fraud out of their own monies. That's going to be extended to telcos.
That's the idea in Singapore at the moment, but given all the vulnerabilities that we identify in the telco space, and this goes not only to telco, the three main spaces that the government has been consulting in the UK, but I've seen in other countries, is around social media platforms, big tech companies in general, and telco companies being in that chain, not heavily regulated at the moment, but probably should have been, so we would work better in preventing fraud. And if that reimbursement clause would apply in telco companies, then that would be a game changer for many participants in the market, because then we not only would have to think about the solutions that we have in place, measures we have in place, but also how do we collaborate, as mentioned in this panel, across different sectors where we know that the money goes from one place to another, or the victims being defrauded from one place.
It also means that there's going to be a liability, a new liability in the value chain. I've got your attention now, don't I? How do you think that liability will flow from telcos through to its partnership supply chain?
I have no idea. There's so many possibilities. Yeah, to be completely honest, everything could happen. And if we look into the recent trends, not only there is going to be the reimbursement clause that is going to affect the financial aspect of that, but we are also observing that fraud, being predicate offense to money laundering, is also getting into the legislation across the world. As there is some new measures such as failure to prevent fraud, where it's going to be criminalized. So even people who are in fraud prevention positions and senior management are going to be criminally responsible for any miss internally. So if you miss to identify fraud, internal fraud, but then also this could be extended if the trends occurs in telco companies also in cases where you when you miss to prevent the fraud, and you could have or should have been considering your size and assets.
Just briefly recognizing happy hour is next. The similar is being discussed in the U.S. It's what's called Regulation E, and so that governs the liability from the financial services to the customer who's provided an access device, is the term of art in U.S. law. And so it's anything or piece of information that can be used to obtain that service. And so that is something that has been introduced in Congress in terms of making that clear. How the U.S. law is structured is it applies to personal accounts, not business accounts, and that's where that is a big factor in the growth of business email compromise or CFO or CEO impersonation cases. Is those small and medium businesses don't have that same liability protection, and so there's different controls put in place at their financial institutions for personal accounts versus business accounts that impact that. But that change of what is an access device, where it is clearly no longer a payment card number or password, it's now biometrics or any range of methods for authentication, does drive that incentive in the US as well.
Michel, are you seeing any such trend in Belgium towards...
I'm not an expert in financial services, but I think that it is part of debate of the PSD3 issue between operators on the one hand and the bank sector on the other end, with pushback from one to another.
Speaking as somebody who was on the board of the independent regulator of phone-paid services 15, 20 years ago, the motto there was always follow the money, and the liability in these cases ended up flowing back down the chain. And it sounds as though in this new world of push payment fraud, something similar may happen. Regulations are being written, voices have to be heard, individual company voices are often less convincing and have less influence than collective voices. So perhaps this is an area where your membership of the MEF can usefully be applied to ensure that as the regulations are written in the United Kingdom and in other territories, they are written in such a way that they help ensure social stability, help protect victims, help protect the financial services, but don't unduly reflect liability upon the CPaaS telecommunications and mobile ecosystem infrastructure. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists very much indeed. Oh, good. If we're allowed to take another question, that's brilliant.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I hope this is a short one. So coming back to telecommunications, question for Matthew. So we are globally quite involved lately in tracebacks that are driven by FCC and the new regulation to avoid CLI spoofing. So I would like to think that when many different companies participate into these tracebacks that take quite a lot of resources eventually, we get to something in some cases, to identify the guilty party. What is done with this? I mean, do we get to anything else than blaming publicly, like we have already seen? I mean, does it get to anything more concrete?
I would say yes. And so, I would share the criticism that law enforcement in general, criminal law enforcement, is not operating at the scale needed given the scope of the problem. And so I encourage collaboration, whether it's with Secret Service, national law enforcement, in the US, state and local law enforcement, it's the bulk of law enforcement, to do that. The challenge, and I think the US dynamic is a bit different because of how telecoms are set up and doing their numbers, is so US telecom and the trace back and trace forward has come a long way. Why that's so important, what that does for law enforcement is we need, I mentioned being a good witness earlier. Let me put it simply, like the telecom is often a witness to the crime, and they sometimes share information with law enforcement without being able to identify or even really help us identify the victim, the perpetrator, any information about them, or the impact. That's an incredibly hard case for us to pick up and run with if you're not helping us identify the victim, the perpetrator, and what was the impact. And so when telecoms work together to be able to identify the origin of that communication, the endpoint of that communication, who it passed through, and ideally with other sectors to identify the financial impact, we're able to work those cases much more effectively. Yes, impersonating the tax collection agency is a crime in most jurisdictions, but we need to be able to show loss to motivate a prosecutor, to motivate a jury, get a sentence. And if the starting off point is me, telecom, I'm a victim of this crime because I was forced to carry this traffic, but prosecutor, you need to go to a court to get a subpoena for us to even provide any information of the crime we claim to be reporting, that's already awkward, right? Law enforcement doesn't normally subpoena victims of crime. And so that, unfortunately, is the posture we're often in working these cases. It's very variable across companies, but I would say, working with your companies to think through and across your industry of how do we be a better witness? How do we be more effective at helping identify information that may be available to you as a company on the perpetrator, the victim, and the impact of the crime is what allows law enforcement to take more effective action. I hope that answered your question.
There is a question, sorry, we're way over time, but speaking as a company that we have knowledge and information about attempted frauds. We're the only people who have it, but we can see people attempting to engage in biometric fraud. And we look at information sharing with law and order, but the question is, what's the business model for that? What do we get back in return? Because there's cost and there's quite a lot of cost, there's effort, it makes us feel quite good. But what's the value exchange in return?
Yeah, I would say for most of the businesses we work with, they identify the value of being trusted, of not having a high volume of criminal activity on their platform, and they see business value in that, which is extremely important for them to recognize, because again, under US law, if you're doing something as a private company for a public safety value at request of law enforcement, you may be considered an agent of law enforcement under US law, which means all of your actions are constrained by US law as it applies to government entities in terms of the collection and use of information. The ideal situation for cooperation is the business identifies a business case where it's important to them to address this activity, and they are voluntarily collecting information, keeping records, and sharing and reporting as appropriate. And I think that is the case across most of the EU, most kind of substantial countries in terms of rule of law tradition. We're maintaining that distinction. And so if you as a company cannot identify your own business case for addressing criminality according on your service, we're going to be in a world of hurt, because you're going to be trying to operate in a regime where you're responsive to only government and only our requirements and mandates, which is inherently reactive and limited and does not reach the scale we need in terms of detection, reporting, record keeping, and all pieces.
I think we've kept all these good people away from the happy hour, perhaps longer than was due. Thank you very much indeed to our esteemed panel for that fascinating review. Thank you. Thanks a lot.